This episode is brought to you by Active Digital, where we help customer-obsessed companies become destination brands.
There's kind of like a good news, bad news element to Conway's Law, right? I think the good news is that there does tend to be that natural alignment between how your people organize themselves, how your systems get organized, which we can talk about a little bit on the technical side of the house, right? And ultimately how that mirrors your communication structures.
All right, folks. So today we're going to talk about why your people seem to have trouble communicating. Let's get into it. Do you want to decommoditize your products and services? Do you want to become a destination brand, increase your revenue, and have more control over your pricing? You're in the right place. Each week, we'll talk about how to create great customer experiences and how to orient your company to enable them. We're your hosts, Devin and David, and this is the Experience Leader Podcast. All right, folks, welcome back to the show. So excited to come back with another topic here. Trying to introduce a couple new things here that we're going to get into. We're going to talk about some things that are interesting in the industry, and we're also going to be giving you what we're reading. So trying to add a couple of pieces of things here that I've wanted to do for a while. And I think that it's going to be a lot more fun to do that with my man, David. David, how are you doing, man?
Man, I am cold. It is. Took my kids to the bus stop this morning. It's like 21 degrees outside. I was like, I thought Virginia was supposed to be warmer than this, but apparently not. So that's the real answer, brother. Is that I'm just cold.
Hey, I've never lived farther than Charlotte, North Carolina, and that's for a reason. That's for a reason. So like, you guys still have snow on the ground up there?
There's a little on the ground, although I grew up in Pittsburgh, right? So anyone that's still up there would laugh at me for saying there's snow on the ground because it's in pieces. But I don't know. It's cold to me right at this point in my life. So yeah, man, we're hovering below that 32 mark for sure.
Nah, yeah. See, 21 degrees is definitely cold. I mean, you know me. Anything below about 50, and I don't even want to be outside. So
no doubt. Although I see in my son what my deal was when I was growing up in Pittsburgh, which is like, the sun's out, Dad. Can I wear shorts today? It's like, dude, that doesn't actually mean that it's warm. So yeah, funny how those conversations still pop up.
My son makes me feel like a wuss because he sees the sun outside. He's like, Dad, can I go play outside? I'm like, Dad, son, it's legit. Like, yeah, it's legit 32 degrees outside.
Yeah, we're not doing that.
I don't think you want to do that. But I should just let him do it because maybe he's more of a man than me. So maybe I'm messing up.
Yeah.
Oh man. So want to get into talking about some news, man. Couple things that we saw happen. One, Outback Steakhouse kind of nixed their chief customer officer role. And then, like, on the other side of that, Bed Bath & Beyond added their first chief customer officer role. And I find this stuff interesting because, I've kind of wrestled with, who owns the customer experience, right? Like who owns that? I've seen a lot of companies kind of add that chief customer officer role or chief experience officer role. And I've always wondered, like, is that a fluff C-suite role or is it like real? That they're all kind of vanity titles that are out there. I'm not trying to, trash anybody's company or anything. Just been around long enough to know how those games work. But I'm, on the one hand, I've been glad that companies have added roles like that. Just if for nothing else, that they add focus and they show that the customer experience is important at the highest levels of the company. On the other side of that, I've had, I kind of feel like, I obviously the buck stops with the CEO, right? Mm-hmm. Like the buck stops with the CEO on the customer experience. It's my hope that more CEOs, really take it as being an important an important part of the way the business operates, an important part of the strategy. It's the whole reason this podcast exists, right? Trying to reach more CEOs with that. But I'm curious about your thoughts on who in the C-suite should own the customer experience.
Man, I mean, you hit on. We could do a lot of episodes on this topic, right? I mean, if we're being honest, even day jobs for you and me, a lot of our time is spent on this topic, right, and helping organizations through this. So lots of good stuff. But to answer the question that you asked, no disagreement on ultimately the buck stops the CEO, and that is who needs to drive, both the CEO and the board. If they're not focused on customer first, if they're not backing initiatives, and a lot of that is where's the wallet going, right? Not just kind of what you talk about every quarter, but where's the wallet going? That's going to lead a lot of the direction culturally for the rest of the organization, including the rest of the C-suite, right? I mean, everybody rolls up to somebody, right? And at some point, that's where it needs to come from. I do think this is definitely a good topic for us to continue to talk about. I do think that it is interesting though when you look at a chief customer officer type of role versus chief digital versus kind of the innovation transformation type roles that pop up, mostly for the same reason, right? Which is, at least to your point, at least organizations are identifying that gap. They're making a concerted effort to start to fill it. The irony there in some cases, in other cases, actually, if you look at the Bed Bath Beyond example, they're taking from Target for the most part, like the humans are coming from Target. If you look at what Target's been able to do in the last 2 or 3 years and the investment they've made, I would point to that as being a smashing success for them, and certainly very timely. So that's an example of, ROI I can't speak to, I'm not in the room, but I would think that accomplished what they set out to do. There are some cases, though, where, funny enough, you bring on a chief, customer officer or maybe even a chief experience officer, and all it does is it actually kind of hides the problem for a while, right? Because then everybody else takes a step back, and you don't want the rest of the C-suite acting as though the customer isn't their problem or isn't their focus, right? And so lots of funny dynamics there, definitely something we can talk about. But with Outback in particular, that's always been a brand that's, I don't know, I guess it's just, I'll try not to bring my personal, where do I like to eat? And I don't understand the whole middle market chain thing very well, if I'm being honest. But I will say this, you cannot roll by an Outback on a Friday or Saturday night without a parking lot full of cars. So they definitely have the following. They've managed to be a staying brand. With even just kind of looking at Wall Street Journal and how they described it, it was almost as if they said, well, we got some more digital experiences up and running, particularly on the takeout side of things, and now we're good to move on and sort of push that to marketing / so CMO, CIO is going to kind of take over that. I'll be honest, to me, that kind of sounds like double down, right? Not back away. So a little strange for me. Again, I'm not in the room. Maybe there's another dynamic there, but so love for the folks that are investing, like a Bed Bath Beyond, like a lot of the other retailers we're seeing. I think it's great. For the folks that are backing away, it's curious timing, but to each their own.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I definitely agree with you on the need for the entire C-suite to see the customer as their focus. And that is exactly what I worry about a lot of times when a specific role is created, that people will be like, oh, they do customer, right? Instead of everybody thinking about how they can optimize their corner of the business to serve the customer better, that there's the possibility of this person kind of being seen as the sole shepherd of that. Now, I'm sure that there are organizations where it works great, right? You have that person who is taking a look at the total customer experience and, kind of working with their colleagues in the C-suite to make that stuff happen. but I think that it's hard. It's hard for any one person to own that. Besides the CEO, really, it's hard for any person below the CEO to own that and to have the relational and organizational capital to drive change. It's just something I worry about all the time when I see these.
No, you nailed it. It takes juice, man. It does. It's too complex and it's hard to, especially at larger organizations, Fortune 50, Fortune 100, no one member of the C-suite other than the CEO has the juice to do it. I mean, it's complex, the tech side of it, the customer flow side of it, what it means to do customer care properly, how that flows into sales and marketing. Again, this is stuff we could talk about for days, but that's complex, and eventually people need to make decisions and go with them, and that's where it gets hard because each person in their own little room, it's hard to do that for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel for all the people who are in the CCO role out there. I know you got a big job, and you're not always set up for success. But it's awesome to see people get it in a spot that says at least that it's a thing that the company cares about and is willing to invest dollars in. But yeah, my advice to anybody in that role is definitely make sure that you are not seen as the person who is solely responsible for it. So no doubt. The next thing that I'm excited about, not that I can afford one, but Ferrari is hiring Johnny Ives' design firm to work on across their whole business, apparently. And this is kind of coming at the juncture where they're starting to get into electric. They said that their first car is going to show up in 2025, their first electric car. I'm kind of an Apple fanboy. Johnny Ive clearly has designed some of the most iconic products. My background is as a designer, kind of like, you see Johnny Ive and you gotta throw up the salute. So the idea of him working on a Ferrari is just awesome. The grown man designer in me is super happy, and the little boy in me who still has some model cars, especially the F355, is super happy. I cannot wait to see what Johnny Ive does with a Ferrari.
Man, it's when you talk about brands with staying power, Ferrari is up there with the very, very best. I love cars. You and I have talked about this before, but I started like my college career thinking that I was going to be an aerospace engineer, not because I wanted to design planes, but actually because I wanted to design cars, right? I wanted to build them. So for me, like, always been a passion. And you look at a brand like Ferrari, it was interesting. I'm drawing a blank now on the name of the series, but Netflix did their F1 documentary series that went through a couple of years. Fantastic. Behind the scenes, just so cool to have literally only 10 teams in the entire world that are competing, right? One of the things that I found, very, very cool series in general. One of the things that I found most interesting, though, and obviously, like, I've been an F1 fan for a long time, so I kind of had the knowledge of this. But if you, as an objective viewer of that series, I think one of the things that most people would probably be curious about is, like, Ferrari doesn't, in the last couple of years, they have not placed in top 2, top 3, top 4, and they've had some bad years. And yet, every time you hear, not just fans, not just people that are in the industry, but every time you hear the drivers, the general managers talk about that Ferrari team, it was still with reverence, and they're getting their butts kicked recently, right? Which is a different topic. Well, why is that, right? It's because Ferrari is still Ferrari, right? And I don't want to say they always will be, but they've certainly managed to hold on to that. So very cool to see. It's almost, if you look at what Johnny Ive was able to do, obviously alongside the leadership at Apple, to revive that brand in a very specific way. Ferrari doesn't need revival, but as they enter into the electric car race, it's, the competition's stacking up. It's becoming easier to build high performance vehicles. That isn't to say that the art isn't still there to doing it the right way. So super fascinating to see what they're able to do together, whether that's in the vehicles themselves or, the other thing that's crazy is there was when I was living in London, there was a Ferrari, just a retail store that was a few blocks down from where my office was. And like that place, people, it was just buying like t-shirts and mugs and whatever else they sold, their hats or whatever, right? My son's got a couple because he like that's his favorite F1 team still, right? There were 100 people outside on on the street waiting just to get into the store, just so they could spend some money on gear. So it's not just it's obviously not just the cars that they're selling to the public or the F1 team or anything else. It's kind of that whole brand. So super interesting to see where this goes. And I agree with you. Couldn't be more excited to see what happens there.
Oh man, yeah. I think that you touched on something that is. It's kind of big to me as I just pay attention to the landscape of EV design, right? I definitely think that like Tesla's come a long way. Like, to be honest, when Tesla's first came out, I wasn't actually super stoked about the design of the cars. I've been a little bit surprised, to be honest, by some of the design decisions made in the EV space. Like the new Mercedes coming out, like the inside, the interior, the technology in that thing is awesome. I mean, just incredible. The exterior, it will have the lowest drag coefficient of any production car ever made. But like, I'm just like, man, I would still rather drive like, one of you guys is, normal, like the E-Class or the S-Class, the look, the feel of that is just so iconic. And so I was hoping that what Mercedes was going to do was create an EV that looked like a Mercedes.
Yeah. And it feels like that would have been a sweet spot for them. They hedged the way Audi did with the to your point, like kind of half in on the, well, what are, it's almost like people are asking the question, like, well, what are EVs supposed to look like? And they're trying to build towards whatever that is. But I don't know that anyone's asking for them to look that way, to be honest with you, right?
Right. Yeah. That's what.
Not everybody needs to build a Cybertruck, right? Like we're good. Like the S-Class is actually beautiful. Like just roll with it, right? Like just flip out the engine, please. Like that's it.
give me, flip out the engine, give me a frunk, if they had done that, it would just be like, well, I was waiting for somebody to do that, right? Like my whole thing's like looking at Tesla over the years. Now, granted, their design lately has gotten much better, in my opinion. Their design has definitely gotten better. The Model S definitely looks a lot better, in my opinion. Definitely liking the look of the Model 3 more and more. But like, I've also kind of been sitting back like, well, Mercedes, when you gonna jump in the ring? And then Mercedes jumped in the ring, and I was like, "What is this? Yeah. What is that?"
Well, you know who's nailing it? And this is, we could, again, I love that we can talk about all these things forever. But Ford right now, if you look at the F-150, let's put the Mustang Mach-E to the side for a second. Which I like it, but that is a deviation for them, in the direction we're talking about. But if you look at the F-150 that's coming out, the Lightning. This sounds funny, but if you look at the E-Transit van that's about to come out next month, they did pretty much what we're saying, which is take the thing that already exists that people love, obviously electrify it so that you've got that going for you. In the Transit van, they kept it, other than a nice little screen in the middle inside, like they kept it kind of the same, right? With the F-150, you get the benefits, which this is, again, totally different topic, but I think it's going to be a game changer for them that they're going to sell a truck. They're the first ones to have a legit truck that people recognize that's got the frunk, because I think, anyone that didn't buy a truck because they couldn't figure out where to put things, like problem solved, right?
Oh, yeah.
But like they took a very direct path to get there, which is, let's just take this thing that is the best selling vehicle in the world. Let's switch out the stuff we need to, right, to get on this new train. And then when that rolls out this year, it's an F-150. Like, what can you say? People buy them all the time, right? So definitely different approaches. But yeah, fascinating to watch folks try to design towards a look or a feel that, like maybe that does push everybody in that direction, but hard to be on the cutting edge or the bleeding edge sometimes, I suppose, right?
So. I think we could definitely get into that because I'm just going to ahead and put it out there. I cannot stand the look of the Mach-E. I cannot stand the look of that
funny.
thing.
I have yet to see one in person. I've seen images that I like. All the ones that I see driving around, I don't know if it's just a question of choices or what, but like, yeah, no thanks.
Man. Like somebody's got to drive it, man. You could drive it. Somebody's got to drive that thing. I look at that thing and I'm just like, dadgummit, what were you guys thinking? Like,
oh man,
you made the boss. You know what I'm saying? You made, like, come on, man. Like, come on. What are you guys doing? Well, all good. Let's get into talking about the main thing here. So, I will say that all of these things we could jump into. We are definitely going to have to jump into the car discussion. I want to jump into at some point with you just your experience buying different cars. You're a car guy. We've talked about this. What it's been like to buy different cars. We got to do a whole episode on that. But that'll come. So get ready.
Love it.
All right. So today we're talking about communication, and we're talking about that kind of from the lens of Conway's Law. And if you've never heard of Conway's Law, I'll read it off briefly here. It's very simple. Organizations who design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of these organizations. And so that's saying a couple of things, and it's actually generally really profound because you start to think about org structure and all these things. All of that stuff winds up feeding into the communication structures in your company. Culture affects that even beyond org structure, but those things wind up affecting how products and services are made and delivered. And it affects the customer. It affects the customer experience. I'm sure that we can all think about things that we have experienced with companies where you call up, you're trying to get help. They're like, oh, that's not my department. I got to send you over here. And then that person's like, oh, well, that's not my department either. I got to send you over here. We all can probably think of multiple instances where that happened, where you're on the other end listening to smooth jazz. And I love smooth jazz, but when I'm trying to get something done, it's not exactly what I want to do is listen to smooth jazz while you're on hold, waiting to get to the next department, thinking, what on earth? Or situations where you're engaging, you're going through the process of buying a product, and you're interacting with different people and you're having to repeat yourself. Yep. Because it's clear that those people are not talking to each other. They either don't have the technology in place to make sure that the next person in the chain is brought up to speed. There's clearly not a conversation that's happening. They don't have the data, or they don't have context on the data that they can see. And it makes a frustrating experience for the customer. So the first question I always pose when I work with companies on this are you designing the way that the organization is going to be structured around the customer? My work in innovation consulting, that was one of the things that I would question people on is, how are you structuring the org to support this new thing that you're doing? We're talking about innovating, moving past business as usual. How are we moving towards an organizational structure that supports this new thing that you want to do? So I'm curious, David, about your thoughts on this and generally kind of what you've seen in your career, how org structure and communication affects products and services.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit on a couple of really good things already, on this topic. There's kind of like a good news, bad news element to Conway's Law, right? I think the good news is that there does tend to be that natural alignment between how your people organize themselves, how your systems get organized, which we can talk about a little bit on the technical side of the house, right? And ultimately how that mirrors your communication structure. So as you start to kind of turn the ship on the communication side, the good news is it actually is possible to have those things follow, right? And to have the individuals that are responsible for those things within the organization be motivated to better align as you make changes. So that's the good news, right? Is that there's alignment. The bad news sometimes is that it's hard if you've gotten pretty far off course on that front. So you mentioned, sometimes you talk to organizations and it's very clear that the way that they are organized, the way that their experiences, both internal and external, the way their systems are organized, right? Like that stuff might not necessarily be geared towards the customer and may have been something that was either easier or lower hanging fruit, or frankly, just somebody's experience in the way things are done from the past, and all of a sudden you end up with this like kind of funky mismatch where internally things may feel consistent, but your customer is not feeling like you're aligned to them, and you called out a lot of kind of symptoms that then come from that. So for me, it's definitely a question of, it actually ties into some of the, we were talking about CCO, CDO, Chief Innovation Officer type roles earlier, in this conversation. And it comes back to, does the organization at large actually understand who they're selling to, what the needs are of those customers, what jobs the customer is actually hiring the organization to do, and the more people understand that, then I think when you get to, okay, let's talk about how we're marketing or selling. Let's talk about how we are servicing customers that already exist and are, customers of our current customers of ours. Let's talk about how our systems are arranged so that we have some agility in digital experiences, in the way that data flows through the org, et cetera. Again, like those things, they're fairly malleable in the sense that they can change in relatively short order, right? There's almost always low-hanging fruit there. We have a lot of these conversations, in our day jobs, and so it's again, the good news is you can make change, for sure, but this is a big source of frustration, I think, for most organizations. Is just feeling what it really comes down to is, you can feel like you've done everything right, and you can actually feel very cohesive internally and actually be missing the mark by a pretty large margin. And that's the thing that's really frustrating, is thinking that maybe you've got it pretty well sorted and then just not seeing the output and coming to terms with maybe why that's the case. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's, it kind of speaks to one of the questions that you wind up having to ask is, are your systems set up for your own efficiency and to make your job feel easier? Are they set up for the customer experience, to make the customer experience better?
Yeah, no doubt. It was funny. We were, when we were talking about doing this episode, and I had done some little bit of digging and found this article from 1999. So, from an internet standpoint, right, that was infancy. It feels like that was 300 years ago. But there was a guy named Nigel Devin, I'm assuming is how you pronounce his last name, but he was sort of lamenting the state of early stage websites that were clearly made to check the box for what the organization was doing, right? Versus, so, his main thesis was that organizations often produce websites with content and structure that mirrors the internal concerns of the org rather than the needs of the user of the site. And for anyone that's old enough to remember what websites looked like in 99, right? It was either like a very kind of cookie cutter, you had your nav and basically just some text, and, it was basically Wikipedia, not even, or you just took something that was on paper and you just like replicated that the best you could, and it just looked like a really bad, like the kind of word art you might use if you were like back in the 90s, if you were creating a Word doc that you wanted to print out for a flyer, right? Like that's what sites looked like. But what I found interesting about that is I think there's a lot of, yes, technology has improved greatly since 1999, but if you think about how folks are choosing to engage with their customers, there's still a lot of that where it's like, we're going to build this experience based on how we think about ourselves as the organization versus like, why would someone even be here wanting to learn about, interact with, etc. So, this is, even on the digital front, this is a battle that I think folks have been fighting for quite some time now.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've built a lot of websites in my day, but before I got into product design and then into strategy work. I started my career out doing graphic design and then doing web design and doing front end development, and got to work on some big websites for big brands, which was really cool. Worked on all kinds of things. I built so many of them. And one of the things that was always interesting is as we were going through the process of determining what the information architecture of the site was going to be, it's one of the areas that when I heard Conway's Law, I instantly said, that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true because of my experience in web design and building websites and seeing how the different stakeholders wound up kind of trying to impress their will on the information architecture based on, kind of their corner of the kingdom. And it was interesting to see that people kind of naturally expected that their group was going to have a whole section on the site. And, they're not necessarily thinking like, hey, this is the information that the customer needs to know. It's just, hey, we expect to have a call out on the homepage and we expect to have a section on the site. And I started to see that's, it was like, well, if we're not there, and it's not, not every single organization within a company expects to have their section, but the ones that are more that can be more customer facing or can have a lot of influence in the company tend to want that. And I found it interesting that the conversation was more about, well, we want representation.
Yep.
And not enough. This is what the customer needs to know in order to be able to further themselves on the path to making a decision about whether they're going to buy your product or service. I know that a website can do a lot more than that, but that's the main thing. When these companies spend hundreds of thousands and now millions of dollars on websites, that they're expecting that return, and that's the main job. And keeping the main thing is very important to the success of it. Not necessarily whether the credit card group got their massive call out on the homepage. That's not necessarily what it's about.
There's no doubt. And I think some of that too is just purpose, right? Purpose of, whatever medium it is, whatever the artifact or the component is, being honest as an organization about the purpose of that thing in the scheme of how you're interacting with your customer. There was Atlassian did a nice little case study on, it's the Australian Center for Moving Images. And so this is a physical building that you can actually go in and experience sort of Australian moving image art, right? So TV, movies, all the rest. And so getting even away from websites and more towards just pure experience of a customer coming in. And one of the things that I thought that was really interesting about that, the process that group went through to really redesign their organization and their overall experience on their customer was this idea of like, well, what is the purpose of this thing? So in this case, it's what's the purpose of this building? Why do people come here, right? And in some cases, and even websites even fit into this sometimes as well, not always, but sometimes, which is, I think it was the head guy at the ACMI said, if I see an amazing piece of art in a gallery, it stays with me for many years. It's not transactional in that commercial sense of did the customer get what they came for, right? And so now that isn't to say that there aren't other components of the experience that are going to be transactional. At the end of the day, right, those things happen as well. But sometimes it's identifying the purpose of the thing and being able to frankly minimize a little bit, right? And say, yeah, let's just build around that. Let's not worry about giving every group in the organization representation, right? Like, we sell cars, like, people probably don't care about the accounting org. Like, no offense to the accountants out there, I love y'all, but like, no one needs to read about you. Frankly, no one needs to read about most of the people probably. Or on the flip side, maybe they actually do, because that is the heart and soul of where these vehicles come from and the inspiration for them. That's a decision that you can make, right? But again, it comes back to, what is the purpose for why that touch point is occurring? Or even if you go kind of beyond the touch point, how do you want that customer over their lifetime to interact with your brand and to be transformed by it potentially, right? So there's a lot of kind of fun, sort of rabbit trails we can go down on that. But a lot of that comes back to, if you're being, A, if you actually understand your customer, and B, if you're being honest about the experience that is expected for the thing that you're talking about, it does allow you to actually simplify, but lean into what that is.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's the, when we talk about, communication affecting, an output, when you think about the website, when you think about a lot of different things, think about the building, right? You think about how a building winds up being structured, how especially a retail space, you have to think about, again, like, what is that job? What's the purpose? And when we think about purpose, thinking about it in terms of that job to be done, thinking about it in terms of service to the customer, obviously not just, not at the expense of all else, right? Like, I'm always gonna wear the employee experience hat. You need to be thinking about also how to make things easy for your employees to take care of your customers. But when you think about those outputs, whether it's design of website building, et cetera, of communications that go out to the customer, are you able to map it back to that path that the customer's going through to make progress in their life? And I love what you said about purpose, because it allows you to think in that way, and getting your teams together and saying, hey, we're gonna create this thing, and we need to measure it against how we're helping this person make the progress that they want to make, or helping this company make the progress that they want to make. If you're in the B2B space, obviously that can get really complex because there's multiple buyers, et cetera. And you and I both spent a lot of time in the B2B space. That gets into multiple people, multiple vectors there. People have different things that they want, and you've got to give them all what they want. Is this thing in service of allowing our customer to make progress? Because without that, you don't get to have a company, right? So that is the ultimate, right? It's the highest, it's the highest purpose there, and everything kind of has to feed that. And knowing what that is critical.
Absolutely, and I think that extends to we talk a lot about empowerment, employee empowerment to do the right thing, by the customer. I think there's also kind of a systems and data empowerment element too, which is a little more abstract, but still points to that idea that, there's going to be self-service opportunities and other ways that your customers are interacting with your brand, your digital products, right? It's not just fluffy. Like, there are e-commerce experiences that are transactional that, there's no human involved there other than, the one that's on the other end that you call your customer, right? And so I think, the identification of those elements that you've kind of walked through, and then transforming that into ways to empower those engagement points, right? Those environments in which your customers are interacting, to where it's like, no, they can get, meaning the customer can get what they need when they need it, and then some, right? And we're going to empower our employees. We're going to empower the people on the front lines to be able to do that. And there's it's largely cultural, right? In how that works. And then, you get into kind of the tactical around, well, how do you do that? And we've had conversations about that, and we'll continue to talk through that. On the tech side, on the digital side, it's the same question, right? Which is, okay, yeah, but what are those types of things, right? And it can be as simple as just, do your customers have a straight path forward to do what they need to do, but also, are the resources there for them to figure out what's missing in that moment, right? Easy stuff that people point to, like a chatbot or something, and that's all fine, but it's less about the tools, because there are plenty of tools out there, and it's more about just that ethos of, yeah, but when your digital product teams are building those experiences, are they thinking about it in that way? Or much like, some of this other stuff we're talking about that has less to do with technology, are they just looking for an efficient solution to kind of check the box on, hey, we need to add a chatbot to the website, or we need to, integrate this data with this data? Well, okay. And there's a fast way to do that, and fast might be the right answer if there's a reason for that. But there's also the, like, what are you actually trying to drive, right? And can you enable that type of capability for your end customer in such a way that you've actually, 1% better every day, right? Like, not in some world-changing way, but that you just continue to improve upon the way that your customer interacts with your brand.
Absolutely. And I think that there's obviously the need for that balance, right? You want to be able to get that solution out there, whatever that little thing is, even if it is as small as a chatbot.
Yep.
You want to be able to get it out there, but to your point, just kind of throwing stuff at the wall to see what sticks, can wind up affecting, it winds up affecting the customer experience, therefore affecting your brand. So, we have to be able to balance that whole speed to market thing with how is this impacting the brand? And that's one thing that I know
yes.
that I tend to come from the side of like, yes, like we need to do something to generate results here. However, let's think about how this impacts our brand. And I know I've probably been in a lot of meetings where people are just like, oh, here comes Devin with the brand thing.
Yeah. Well, but I think you nailed it, right? Which is experimentation, speed to market, all that good stuff, right? Like move fast and break things. Like there is all of that from a, how do you actually roll real, shippable product out that you can iterate on? Fantastic, right? It's the umbrella under which that operates that's important, and you're kind of pointing to that, right? Which is like, but is somebody keeping an eye out for, well, what did that do? And as you're measuring the impact and the success of any of those things, right? Is it just, well, we launched and it feels relatively bug-free, therefore it must be a success, right? Or, even if you're looking at something like, like monthly actives or something like that, right? Those are all great metrics in terms of, are people using it? Does it seem to work? Does it function the way we thought it would? Great. But also, what was the purpose for adding that into the mix? And has that sufficiently raised the bar on the experience the way that you thought it might, right? And what's hidden in that statement is, did you even have a thesis on that going into it, number one? And do you have the ability to measure that, after the fact, right? So you get beyond some of the easy metrics that, some orgs even struggle with, monthly actives and performance and these sorts of things in terms of how to measure it. But when you get beyond that and you start to level up a little bit, then you look at like, yeah, but is it better or is it just different? And what do we do about that?
Right. Yeah. That touches on something super important. That it gets into, we're going to talk about org design. It gets into that a little bit, but it gets into incentive, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of people will act off of what they're incentivized to do. Kind of going back to the website thing, people wanting that representation, different business groups wanting, representation on the website is because they have incentives that they're trying to hit, and they think that if they get visibility, that is going to help them do that. And they're not entirely wrong on those things, right? But the issue there is, am I thinking about the customer? Are my incentives structured for me to act in a way that is in the customer's best interest? That affects that whole, the speed to market, the metrics that we start winding up getting like laser focused on, like, okay, I've got my OKRs. I got to move this, I got to move this metric this much. Or I got to accomplish this objective. I got to hit this key result. Like, okay. Are you thinking about how that affects the customer in total? Like, yeah, you hit that mark. You say, hit that mark, did my job. But there's another level of evaluation. It needs to say, what kind of ripple effect did I have on the experience, right?
No doubt. And that gets into, I think, even when you look at organizational design, particularly looking at Conway's law and some of that alignment that he alludes to, you start to look at organizations that tend to put large teams together, and Conway was coming from kind of that software design, systems design viewpoint, and so the alignment that you'll see a lot of times is large teams that result in large monolithic systems, small teams that kind of result in smaller, more agile systems that are more purpose-built. But when you then extrapolate that or carry that over and look at real life examples of how that plays out in the ability to launch things, and then to, like we've been talking about, to create hypotheses that can then be measured after the fact. One of the kind of the practical things that you see is that organizations that have empowered smaller teams in a cross-functional way, not just the technical version of cross-functional, which is, do you have a designer, a developer, a tester, like that's all good. Listen, that's a world I come from, like, yay, DevOps, all good. But it's more than, what we're talking about is more than that, right? It's, does the team, and that's everybody from the product owner to whoever they're serving, down through the individuals that are involved in designing and rolling this out. Does the team, to your point around incentives, do they have the incentive to build the thing that is going to impact the customer in a specific way? Because the more that you can do that, and the smaller the teams are that have the ability to do that, that's how you creep closer and closer to best of both worlds, which is fast speed to market, smaller teams that are willing to build smaller purpose-built experiences, systems, etc. Interoperability becomes kind of the go-to, which is important, right, from a technical standpoint. And you're getting the benefit of folks that feel like they can take some chances, but they can take chances knowing that success is measured in a very specific way, and it doesn't necessarily just have to do with, again, all of the normal stuff around, bug free, so code quality and did we launch on time, etc. But there's also this element of, are we driving the customer forward in a particular way or more than one particular way, depending on the situation. So it's like, that is easier said than done sometimes, but smaller teams fully empowered with that worldview of what they're doing, like that is a proven recipe, and you can see it time and time again of how enterprises can start to pivot in the right direction.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and that, kind of getting back to that overarching question, why can't my people communicate? Right. You've got so many things that factor into that small team part of it. When we think about, okay, when is a team getting too large to be able to effectively communicate, right? We've always heard the famous, I think it's Jeff Bezos' 2 pizza box rule, right? And I'm not trying to say that I have a theory of everything with regards to team size, but I will say that I've seen in both large and small organizations, the most effective way to structure those things winds up being having that cross-functional group who is centered around a particular thing that winds up driving customer value. So, in larger organizations that, wound up looking like pods, and you had those different people around there, that team was close knit. They knew that they had their thing they had to work on. And if you were good at what you were doing, you were in constant communication with the other pods. There were regular organizational cadences of talking about what we're working on, why we're working on it. Here's the bigger picture. Leadership is involved to constantly remind everybody of the bigger picture. In small organizations, that gets easier. It definitely gets easier. You don't have to have, in my opinion, quite as much rigor. But there's sort of like a critical mass that you hit. And once you get past a certain point, it doesn't matter if you have 100,000 employees or you have like 100 employees. Some of that rigor winds up having to be the same and just continue to scale up. Yeah. But there's a critical mass you hit where things start breaking and you're thinking like, oh, we're not a big company. Why aren't people talking? Why aren't things working? It's because you've specialized, you've specialized far enough that people are focused on their particular area. However, you haven't made sure that the organization evolves to make sure that communication follows the level of scale. And I've seen that happen. And, being at companies that have started to grow to that number where, you're like, oh man, like, I don't even know everybody that's around here anymore. I never talk to them. I never work with them. And then you find out that something that you're working on, they're going to wind up working on later on, and your teams aren't talking. Because that rigor hasn't been put in place. Because we're growing fast, we're moving fast, we're breaking things, and we're hitting numbers, we're growing revenue, but we're not looking at how our ability to deliver is starting to degrade as we scale. Yeah,
you hit on the two things for me that always seem to pop up, right, as scale occurs, and lots of good research out there on how scale impacts like what we're talking about. But I think the team itself, right? When the question of like, well, how big is too big? When you're within a specific small-ish team, the idea that you need to understand what everybody else's role is on that team. And the second the team gets too big for you to understand what everybody's role is, it's probably too big, right? And that's going to vary a little bit. Like 2 pizza boxes, sure. There are probably, it tends to like, the consulting answer is like, it depends. Like, but honestly, the second that people don't understand what even one of their teammates is doing in that construct, it's probably too big and that needs to be looked at. And then when you start to scale out those teams, and this is kind of what you were hitting at, right, is like you also you then need to ask yourself as an organization, whether that's someone who runs a business line, somebody that's sitting in that CEO seat, or anybody kind of in between, you need to constantly be questioning for all of the initiatives that we have going on, the teams that we've kind of put involved to handle those things. What do we have in place that actually stitches that together, and that any individual in the organization could look at this thing and say, okay, I see how the pieces come together, right? So in other words, if there's 1,000 people, there's no way that I'm going to know what all 1,000 are doing. But if I know what my 10 are doing that are on my team, and I've got maybe 15 teams across the org, right, or 20 that are working on stuff, and I can actually tell you, okay, well, of those 20, like 5 of them are kind of doing this, and these 5 and these 5, and here's how that all kind of comes together, and here's who we're integrating with, and all that good stuff. Like, that's enough, right? But it takes diligence, because somebody has to constantly be checking as we grow. Are those connection points there, et cetera, right? So it definitely takes focus in both of those areas, and that's hard, right? Because frankly, the other side of scale is that you're usually moving fast enough to where you can't think about some of those things. So it's tricky. It's tricky.
It is, yeah. I mean, if it was easy, everybody would be doing it, and we wouldn't be making this episode. Right?
No doubt.
I mean, the technology side of that, pretty big, right? Technology side of that, obviously we've talked about that here in pockets. Obviously, you have to be able to set up technological systems, like you said, to make sure that somebody from the outside can go and look and see what is the thing, what's the purpose of the thing, et cetera, right? When it comes to the customer, when it comes to interacting with the customer, technology has to be set up so that the next person in the chain of serving the customer can go in and look at the data and say, this is the thing. This is the purpose of this is what this person's trying to accomplish, etc. Culturally, there's all kinds of stuff that has to go in there. So I'm not going to pretend that this is purely a technology problem. You've got to have process, you've got to have culture that wants to understand the customer and make sure that the next teammate knows what's going on, right? But being able to give that view, the things that we wind up getting hired for in our day job, to wind up giving somebody a 360 view of the customer with technology, that kind of stuff is super important. Especially now in a much more distributed work world. It was important before, but it's even more important now.
Yeah.
It's tough to be able to do that. But having that infrastructure in place gives you the fighting chance to be able to do that. I personally think that it is extremely difficult at any sort of scale to be able to support a customer properly across distributed teams, or across, even if you're co-located across different parts of the organization without really seamless technology that allows different groups of people to get the information they need at the right time.
I couldn't agree more. I had the privilege of helping an organization that I won't name, but let's say it's they've got the largest private network in the world. So you can start to figure out, public entity with the largest private network in the world. And that's about all I'll say about that side of things. But I will tell you that the scale of what they were trying to do, from a technology perspective, to be able to empower a large group of individuals that are out there with jobs that, you talk about the importance and life and death and all these things, right? This is all of those things in real life, right? So this is not fun and games, right? This isn't, can somebody order another, play crib on Amazon, right? No offense to Amazon, but this is real life stuff, and it's, at that level of scale across the globe, and what you're trying to ultimately enact at, somebody's pocket halfway around the world, doing something that is like, if it's not there in the 3 seconds they need it, bad things happen. And putting a lot of this stuff into action, right? Of seeing, well, how do you, it takes literally thousands of individuals to build the technology that's needed to do that, to scale it in a way that actually does what it's supposed to do at the levels of security that's needed, et cetera. And so there is an art to the stacking of those things, right? The stacking of, what does security look like? Non-negotiable, right? What does data flow look like? Non-negotiable. Where can you start to sort of make small changes in overall experience? Okay, well, what are we actually trying to enact? Not, do we do the same thing we did last year, but how do we tweak that a little bit so somebody doesn't have to wait for that to happen? Or that thing that took 3 weeks to get cleared, how does that get cleared in 35 seconds using automation? But again, not automation for the sake of like, wouldn't it be fun to throw some RPA at that thing, but actually, like, this is important, and the fact that they don't have to wait means that these 17 things can happen downstream, right? So this stuff gets really interesting and fun at scale. It's also fun, honestly, if there's 3 people in a shoebox, like in a startup, right? And you're still having to think through this stuff, which is, what is the value that we are attempting to enact by building this thing, designing this thing, rolling this thing out, right? Like, it always comes back to that. Not easy to do for sure, but I think it's, if I had to kind of wrap that up into, one thing that also ties into why we're talking about this, right? It is the constant sanity check of, how are we communicating internally? If we're being honest with ourselves, where is that coming from culturally? And what are the things we can do to tweak our culture ever so slightly, right? These aren't massive changes that are required, but how do we start to turn the tide 1% at a time, such that the rest of the organization, our systems, the way our teams are formed, et cetera, like, follows suit? And when we look back at ourselves a year from now or 2 years from now, in a good way, we won't even recognize who we are, but our customers will recognize the difference. And that is the point, right? And so for me, it's that flow that every C-suite should be asking themselves, weekly, monthly, like you just have to stay on it or it gets away from you.
Man, that's awesome. I don't even think I can add anything to that. It just you put the bow on it. I mean, that the end goal is that, and you have to be able to constantly evaluate. Are we communicating in such a way that we're delivering that? Are our systems set up to do that? And I think that's a hard thing. Because the more your organization grows, like we said, the more difficult it becomes to have visibility into areas that you need to in order to answer those questions. But it is a thing that we need to be able to keep track of. And as you scale, it's something to pay attention to make sure that you're always giving yourself, to use a pool term, you're always giving yourself a good leave, for the next shot that you need to take.
No doubt.
Making sure that you are keeping tabs and building your organization in such a way that you can keep tabs on those things, because it's absolutely critical to being able to deliver a great experience. Obviously, you have to be able to build your organization such that you are setting up communication structures that serve the customer, that build customer value. As we said before, all of your products, your services are going to wind up reflecting the way that your teams communicate with each other. To paraphrase Conway's law, you want to set up your technology to be able to support that, to empower your teams to be able to do the right thing for the customer at the time that it needs to be done. Obviously there are a lot of different things that go into that. Being able to leverage that technology requires process and cultural rigor. But having that technology there, like I said, gives you a fighting chance. And that org structure at the end of the day is going to impact a lot of that. You want to be able to make Conway's law work for you and not against you. That's one of the things that I always say to my clients as we embark on a journey together. Let's make sure that Conway's law works for us and not against us. So let's map this out and make sure that it's a good fit. Any final thoughts, David?
Love it, man. Nope. I think you nailed it. It really does come down to, these things can all be incredibly useful tools, or they can be crushing, and that's a choice that every org needs to make. The only thing that I'll just kind of reiterate is that, this type of change, like, it doesn't happen overnight. But the incremental, it's not just kind of the cultural increments that can be accomplished, but the fact that kind of the rest of your crew is following you, and that can be massive. I mean, it's, on one hand, it's not overnight. On the other hand, it doesn't take nearly as long as I think some people think it does to really make a difference in their organization and ultimately in the experience of their customers and the way that their customers internalize that brand. So it's doable. We see it every day. So that's I think it's why it gets us excited to talk about this stuff, man.
So just to close us out here real quick, want to talk give me 30 seconds on just what's good in your life, man, that's kind of inspiring you, talk to me about that.
Man, all right. So we need to do an episode about this at some point, because I find especially individual sports to be fascinating from a brand perspective. But Nadal pulling home 21 this weekend, for me, I'm a fanboy. He's been my guy. I think it's been fascinating to watch. But the biggest thing and something that I'm still kind of noodling on is just as he hits 21 with Djokovic at 20, with Roger, at 20 and retired, is just how different those guys are from one another, how they interact with their fan base, their brands, and what it means to tennis, how that kind of flows through, year to year for them. Super fascinating stuff. You couldn't have three people that are more different, that are competing in the exact same sport at arguably the exact same level, which is the highest of the high. But just super fascinating for me. Also, just a cool moment to see Rafa, at least for the time being, take that top spot. So all good, man. Got me excited, but also got me thinking man, these three, they're just so different from one another. So that's my thing, man.
That's awesome, man. I'll say the quick thing. I'm reading a book called Driven to Delight by Joseph Michelli. Really great book on a massive customer experience transformation. We're actually going to have Joseph on the show, so I'm really excited to get Joseph in front of everybody. Yeah, that's it, folks. So until next time, keep outserving your competition on your relentless pursuit to become an experience leader. Catch you in the next one.